Thank you all for coming to support Deep Story. Not long ago, I read a fascinating book titled The Secret of Western Military Victory. Now, where does that phrase come from? It's actually the subtitle of the book. The main title is Carnage and Culture. On the surface, it discusses 9 pivotal battles in Western military history, but what it's really about is how to make an organization powerful. So, in essence, it's a management book. A lot of business leaders, especially after reading this book, started handing out copies to their senior executives, saying, let's figure out how to empower our organization. Gah. Why? Because today's entrepreneurs and CEOs face a fundamental dilemma with the rise of the internet. The old school principles of classic management just don't work anymore. So, what's the solution? We have to dig deep, all the way down to the bedrock of human history. Let's take a look at historical wars and how military management can teach us to build a strong and effective team. Today, I'll share a case study to explore what modern organizational management can learn from warfare. Our focus: the Battle of Midway. Most of us learned in high school history that the Battle of Midway was the turning point in the Pacific theater during World War II. It marked the moment when the US shifted from strategic defense to strategic offense. Now, if we zoom out and take a broader historical perspective, the eventual US victory in the Pacific War was almost inevitable. Why? Because at the end of the day, war is a contest of national strength, and the economic and industrial disparity between the US and Japan at the time was staggering. Even without the Battle of Midway, it's reasonable to believe the US would have turned the tide at some point. But let's step back to June 1942 and put ourselves in the shoes of the people on the battlefield. Would the outcome still feel so certain? At the time, the future was anything but clear. Just months earlier, in December 1941, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had inflicted devastating losses on the US Pacific Fleet. Sure, the aircraft carriers were spared, but the damage was significant. Then, in May 1942, came the Battle of the Coral Sea. Both sides lost an aircraft carrier, but think about it. For a smaller, already weakened force like Japan, losing a carrier hit hard. For the US, while painful, the loss was more manageable. Still, in that moment, nothing felt guaranteed. This widening gap in naval power meant the stakes were higher than ever in the Pacific. At this point in history, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood as an undefeated force, with victories over China in the First Sino-Japanese War, Russia in 1905, and most recently, the US-Japan's naval dominance was at its peak, basking in what seemed like invincibility. So, if we transported ourselves back to June 1942, could you confidently bet on an American victory? Hardly. Let's revisit the opening moment of the Battle of Midway. On May 29, 1942, the Japanese combined fleet set sail, an overwhelming armada steaming toward Midway. How big was it? Let's do the math. Aircraft carriers, 11 and battleships, 23 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and countless submarines and supply ships, 350 vessels in total. It was the largest single deployment in Japan's naval history. To fuel this operation, Japan burned through an amount of oil equal to its navy's entire annual training and patrol consumption. They were throwing everything into this gamble. Why Midway? 3 reasons. 1. Saving face. The first reason was all about restoring the emperor's honor. After Japan's stunning attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the US wasn't about to stay silent. By April 1942, the Americans had hit back with the audacious Doolittle raid. In this daring operation, a single U.S. aircraft carrier approached Japan, launching bombers to strike Tokyo. Conventional wisdom said this was impossible. Any carrier attempting such a move would be sunk immediately, and even if the planes bombed Tokyo, they wouldn't have enough fuel to return. But the Americans outsmarted Japan. After bombing Tokyo, the planes didn't return to their carrier. They flew to airfields in China instead. This bold move, dramatized in the movie Pearl Harbor, shocked Japan and humiliated its navy. Internally, Japan's military had a critical weakness: the deep rivalry between its army and navy. The army viewed the navy as extravagant and wasteful, while the navy saw the army as crude and unrefined. It often took something extraordinary to force cooperation between the two. The Doolittle raid did just that. Tokyo had been bombed under the emperor's nose, and the army could no longer resist the navy's push to strike Midway. 2. Strategic leverage. The second reason was strategic. Capturing Midway would allow Japan to use it as a springboard for further expansion. Their plan? Take Hawaii and Australia next, effectively turning the Pacific into their private lake. Japan operated with a mindset of limited war. The idea was to knock an opponent down, force them to admit defeat, and walk away with concessions. They thought taking Hawaii and Australia would bring the US to the negotiating table. In their vision, America would say, fine, you can have the Pacific, and shift its focus back to Europe. What Japan didn't realize, however, was that World War II wasn't a war of limited objectives. It was an existential, no-holds-barred conflict. The US wasn't going to stop until Japan was completely defeated. 3. Yamamoto's gamble. The third reason lay in the personality of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese combined fleet. Yamamoto was a national hero, but deep down, he was a gambler. He had pulled off the Pearl Harbor attack and wanted to double down. His mindset was simpler: go big or go home. Yamamoto envisioned Midway as the perfect bait. He planned to take the island, forcing the US Pacific Fleet to sail from Hawaii to defend it. Once the American ships arrived, Yamamoto would trap them in a devastating ambush. In his eyes, this decisive battle would crush American resistance, forcing them to negotiate peace. The operation was mind-bogglingly complex. It involved 350 ships and 6 operational modules working in tandem. Yamamoto's meticulous planning reflected his belief in Japan's superiority. But as we'll see, the risks of this gamble would soon catch up with him. So, let's talk about what the Japanese Navy was thinking during the Battle of Midway. Here's their brilliant plan first. Send 2 aircraft carriers up north to the Aleutian Islands. Now, where is that? Near Alaska. And let me tell you, this place is so barren. Even rabbits won't poop there. Sure, there's a US Navy base up there, but it's not exactly prime real estate. Why attack there then? Simple. It's a decoy. Let's hit the Aleutians and make the Americans think, oh no, we better send reinforcements up north. The goal? Get the US Pacific Fleet in Hawaii to split their forces. Clever, right? Hold that thought. Meanwhile, the main fleet, 6 carriers strong, was steaming toward Midway. 4 of those carriers, under Admiral Nagumo, were tasked with the main attack, and Yamamoto, the big boss himself, hung back with the Yamato, the largest battleship in the world at the time. Now, let me tell you about the Yamato. This thing was a beast. 70,000 tons of naval battery. You know China's Liaoning, not even close in size. And the guns, whew! These bad boys fired shells that weighed more than a ton with a range of 40 kilometers. If an aircraft carrier got caught in the Yamato's sights, game over. One hit and your armor, useless. Two hits, and you're sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Yamamoto parked this monster about 300 miles away from the battlefield. His plan was simple. If any American carriers showed up, boom, he'd take them out. Meanwhile, Nagumo took his 4 carriers to engage at Midway. So, everything's covered. Right? Wrong. This is where the plan gets a little buggy. And by buggy, I mean it's like trying to juggle flaming chainsaws while riding a unicycle. Yamamoto had too many goals. He wanted to capture Midway and annihilate the US Pacific Fleet. It's what we call a two-headed monster. One body, two conflicting minds. Even the Japanese have a proverb for this. You can't chase 2 rabbits at the same time. After the war, one Japanese officer reflected on this and said, Midway was a battle planned by people who didn't understand the sea and executed by people who didn't understand the sky. Now, let's talk about their second big mistake, underestimating the Americans. The Japanese were like, we've got this in the bag. We've got 8 carriers. The Americans, only 2. Why did they think that? Because back in May, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the US lost 1 carrier and another. Yorktown was badly damaged, and Japanese engineers did the math enter and figured it would take at least 3 months, probably 6, to repair Yorktown. So, they didn't even count it. What they didn't know was that the Americans are kind of insane. On May 27, the battered Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor, and in just 68 hours. Yes, how you are as not months, they patched it up and slapped some duct tape on it and sent it back out to sea. By June 2, Yorktown was back in action. Surprise! So, while the Japanese thought they had a 4-2 carrier advantage, the reality was 4-3. Japanese carriers Akaji, Kaga Soryu, and Hiryu, American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the Miracle working Yorktown. But wait, there's more! Let's talk planes. See, the Japanese treated their planes like precious, delicate treasures. They lavished care and maintenance on them, like, oh, my beautiful baby. As a result, their carriers carried fewer planes overall. The Americans, on the other hand, were like, more planes. Sure, load him up. Who cares? We'll just build more. So, even though Japan had 4 carriers to America's 3, the total number of aircraft was about the same, around 300 each. So, on paper, it looked like 4-3 in carriers. But when you factor in the planes, it was basically an even fight. And with that, the stage was set for one of the most epic naval battles in history. So, here's the thing. The entire Japanese plan had one big assumption, that the Americans were absolute morons. Yep. The whole plan hinged on the idea that the US would do exactly what Japan wanted. You're already laughing, right? Yamamoto Izoroku thought he was being super clever. For example, he sent out a bunch of submarines starting on June 1 to set up 2 massive picket lines between Midway and Hawaii. The idea was simple. If any American carriers tried to sneak over and join the fight, bam, they'd either get sunk or, at the very least, the subs would radio home and say, "Hey, boss, they're coming." In Yamamoto's mind, there was no way the US Pacific Fleet could show up at Midway unannounced. Sounds great, right? But here's the problem. What if the Americans already knew the entire Japanese plan? Oops, that's exactly what happened. This is where the intelligence or ends war enters the chat. And oh boy, is it a good story. Here's how it went down. The Americans had these two intelligence officers, both mid-ranking guys who had already cracked the Japanese naval code. Yep, by this point, the US could read Japan's mail like an open book. Every move Japan made was as clear as watching fish in a bathtub. Here's the kicker. The Japanese kept mentioning this place in their messages using the codename AF. Now, the Americans were pretty sure AF was Midway, but they weren't 100% certain. So, what did they do? They played a little trick. The Americans had the troops stationed on Midway send out a message in plain, unencrypted text. That's right, no codes, no ciphers. The message said, "Hey, our water desalination plant is busted. We need supplies ASAP." Naturally, the Japanese intercepted it, got all excited, and reported back to their commanders. "Hey, guys, AF is low on water." Boom! Just like that, the Americans confirmed RF was Midway. Now the US was ready. Admiral Nimitz, the Pacific Fleet's commander, put everything into motion. Reinforced Midway, he packed the island with over 100 planes. And I'm not talking fancy planes. These were whatever he could scrounge up. Old, new, broken, patched up. It didn't matter. They were all thrown onto Midway. Fix the Yorktown. Remember that carrier the Japanese assumed was out of commission for 6 months. Yeah, it was back on its feet in 68 hours. That's how Americans roll. Set a trap by June 1, while the Japanese subs were still getting into position. Nimitz sent his carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the newly repaired Yorktown, 300 miles north of Midway. They were hiding there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And guess what? The Japanese had no clue. Zero. Zilch. They thought the Americans weren't even in the game. Now, the fight begins June 5. Nagumo and his carriers were closing in on Midway. Bright and early, the Japanese launched over 100 planes, fighters, bombers, you name it, straight at the island. The Americans on Midway, oh, they were ready. They scrambled their planes into the air and met the Japanese head on. Chaos erupted in the skies. It was a dogfight of epic proportions. The Americans even sent some of their planes to attack Nagumo's carriers directly. But here's the problem. The US pilots stationed on Midway were, to put it mildly, not great. Nimitz had thrown together whatever he could find. Planes from all eras, flown by pilots with little to no combat experience. These guys were up against the Japanese Zero, one of the best fighter planes of the time, flown by pilots with years of experience. Think about if Japan had been at war since 1937 fighting in China. By now, their pilots were hardened veterans, battle-tested and lethal. And the Americans? Many of their pilots had been, well, civilians just a few months earlier. Store clerks, taxi drivers, mechanics. You name it. Some of these guys probably learned to fly last Tuesday. So, what do you think happened? It was a massacre. The Americans got absolutely wrecked in those first exchanges. Planes were falling out of the sky like confetti at a New Year's party. The Japanese, oh, they were riding high, thinking, man, we've got this in the bag. But here's the thing about being on top. There's only one direction to go. And that's where things get real interesting, but you'll have to stick around for the next part to hear how it all went down. So, here's the deal. The Japanese sent out 7 scout planes to look for enemy ships. Simple enough, right? But, of course, one of these planes had a little issue. Something went wrong with the landing gear or the catapult, so it took off 30 minutes late. Now, those 30 minutes, they turn out to be the most expensive half hour in Japanese naval history. But hang tight, we'll get to that in a minute. Back to Admiral Nagumo. He's watching all this chaos unfold when he notices something irritating. The Americans on Midway have the audacity to launch planes and try to bomb his carriers. Now, these American planes, they're not doing much damage. They're outdated, slow, and generally useless. But they're annoying like a swarm of mosquitoes buzzing around. So Nagumo thinks, you know what? Screw this. Let's just finish them off. He orders the deck crews to swap out the armor, piercing bombs and torpedoes for high, explosive bombs. Perfect for ground targets like Midway. Just blow them up and get it over with, he says. But here's where it gets good. Just as the crews are halfway through the process of swapping bombs, that one late scout plane finally radios back. And what does it say? I think I found some American ships. Maybe, kind of a lot of them. Now let me remind you, in 1942, Japan didn't have radar like the Americans did. Nope, they were still relying on good old-fashioned binoculars and eyeballs to spot enemy ships. Not great. So when this vague report comes in, Nagumo is in a total panic. Here's the dilemma. If those American ships are just cruisers and destroyers, it's no big deal. They're too far away. By the time they get here, it'll be game over. But if there's even one US aircraft carrier in the mix, that's a huge problem. Because a carrier doesn't need to get close. It just sends planes to wreck your day. Now let's go back to the deck for a second. The crews are standing there mid-swap. Half the planes have high explosive bombs for ground targets. The other half, still loaded with torpedoes. It's a hot mess. So what does Nagumo do? He says, Estopai vi awit ing, don't load anything else. Everybody just wait. I'm gonna send a follow-up message to the scout plane and figure out what's actually out there. So time passes. Precious time. Finally, the scout plane radios back. Wait, there's definitely an American aircraft carrier out here. And now Nagumo is really sweating. Not only has he already wasted valuable time, but now he's got another problem, the first wave of Japanese planes. Remember, the ones that bombed Midway. They're on their way back and they're out of fuel. These planes are circling above the carriers, desperately waiting to land. If they don't get on the deck soon, they're going to run out of gas and start dropping into the ocean like dumplings into a hot pot. And Nagumo, he can't afford to lose them. Japan's resources were stretched so thin, every single plane was a precious commodity. So now, Nagumo has two options. Option 1. Clear the deck. He could tell their deck crews to stop loading the bombs, move all the planes out of the way, and let the incoming planes land. Once they're refueled and rearmed, they can go back out to fight, whether it's against Midway or the American carrier. This option is practical, but slow. It would take a lot of time to clear the deck, refuel, and get the planes ready to launch again. And time, not something Nagumo had a lot of. Option 2 true, launch what's ready the other option. Just send up the planes already loaded with whatever bombs they happen to have. Half have torpedoes, half have high explosive bombs. It doesn't matter. Launch them, no doubt, to attack the American carrier that was just spotted. This option saves time, but there's a major downside. These planes would have no fighter escort. And without fighter cover, they'd be sitting ducks for any American planes in the area. The Japanese were already short on resources, so losing planes like this. Painful. Now, if you're Nagumo, what do? You're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Neither option is great, but the clock is ticking, and the Americans, oh, they're about to ruin your day. And here's the kicker, whatever choice Nagumo makes, the chain of events that follows will go down as one of the most disastrous moments in Japanese naval history. So, Nagumo takes a look at the chaos on his flight deck and, in his head, you can practically hear him screaming, "Why? Oh, why did I order them to swap out the bombs earlier? Now his planes are loaded with high explosive bombs, great for bombing Midway, but pretty much useless against American aircraft carriers. He's caught in a serious pickle." Let's break down his two options. Option 1. Launch the planes now. He could just send up the planes as they are. Half have high explosive bombs, the other half still have torpedoes. Whatever. They'll figure it out. This would save time, but there's a huge downside. The planes wouldn't have fighter escort. And without fighter cover, they'd be sitting ducks. Remember, Japan was stretched thin. Losing planes wasn't just a tactical problem, it was an economic disaster. Option 2, clear the deck. His second option, clear the flight deck, bring in the planes from the first wave, which were almost out of fuel, refuel them, rearm them, and then launch a coordinated attack. But here's the catch, this process would take about 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours. And in a battle like this, that's an eternity. Now, Nagumo isn't exactly a decisive guy. He's cautious, a bit of a people pleaser, and not great under pressure. So, what does he do? He chooses to clear the deck. Why? Because he couldn't bear the thought of losing those planes circling above. Japan's resources were too limited, and every plane was precious. But here's the ironic part. This decision to save resources actually ends up costing Nagumo everything. Classic penny wise, pound foolish situation. Meanwhile, there's one guy in the Japanese Navy who sees the writing on the wall, Yamaguchi Taman. This guy is the commander of two carriers, the Soryu and the Hiryu. When he hears about the situation, he immediately sends a message to Nagumo. Launch the planes now. Time is critical. But Nagumo ignores him. Why? Well, some historians have an interesting theory. Nagumo's command room was tiny. We're talking about a cramped 20 square meter space stuffed with officers, messengers, and staff shouting over each other. It was chaos. Compare that to the Americans, where the commanding officer's room was spacious, quiet, and off limits to anyone without permission. Decisions made in peace and quiet tend to be better than those made in a shouting match. So, Nagumo hesitates. He sticks with the clear the deck plan, but just as the planes are landing and refueling, guess what shows up? Here come the Americans. Suddenly, a group of US planes appears in the sky. Torpedo bombers. And let me tell you, this was weird. Torpedo bombers were the slowest planes in the fleet. Normally, you'd expect to see the faster fighter planes first, then the dive bombers, and finally the torpedo planes. But nope, these guys showed up first. Nagumo's reaction. What the heck is going on? But he doesn't waste time asking questions. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns start firing like crazy. Rat, tat, 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 tat. and the torpedo bombers are getting shredded. Here's the thing, these US torpedo bombers were terrible. They were outdated, slow, and easy targets. The Japanese gunners were having a field day, and within minutes, most of the torpedo planes were shot down. Why did the torpedo bombers arrive first? Now, you might be wondering why were the slowest, worst planes the first to arrive? That's a great question, and to answer it, we need to switch perspectives and look at what was happening on the American side. Earlier, when a Japanese scout plane spotted the US fleet, it wasn't just the Americans being exposed. As the Chinese poet said, "You're watching the scenery on the bridge, but someone is watching you too." The Americans knew they'd been spotted, so their ambush plan was out the window. The fleet's flagship, the USS Hornet, had its commander, Admiral Spruance, in charge of the operation. And let me tell you, was Spruance an interesting guy. He was famously quiet and calm, the kind of guy who'd walk laps on the deck while delegating everything to his staff. But when it was time to act, oh, he acted. Spruance launched his planes immediately. And because of how chaotic the launch was, the different types of planes got separated in the air. That's why the slowest planes, the torpedo bombers, ended up reaching the Japanese fleet first. And boy, was that about to create a golden opportunity for the Americans. Here's the situation: Admiral Spruance, the cool-headed commander of the US fleet, is in a tough spot. The Americans have been spotted. The element of surprise is gone. What does he do? Does he panic? Nope. The guy's ice cold. He orders all planes to take off immediately. No waiting for formations, no coordinating fighter escorts with bombers. Just get in the air and head straight for the Japanese fleet. The distance, 150 miles. And here's the kicker, some of these planes didn't even have enough fuel to make it back. Spruance is thinking, I don't care. Just GO. Now, let's zoom in on the USS Hornet. Its planes take off and it's absolute chaos. No one can find each other in the air. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, they all lose contact. It's like a family road trip where everyone's in their own car with no GPS. Some planes can't even find the Japanese fleet, so they just turn around and head back to Midway. In the end, only 15 torpedo bombers make it to the target. And torpedo bombers, oh, they're the saddest planes in this fight. Slow, clunky, flying low. They're basically screaming, "Shoot me." The Japanese anti-aircraft guns light them up. 15 planes go in, and almost all of them are shot down. But wait, it gets worse. Here come more torpedo bombers. Just as the Japanese are finishing off those 15 torpedo bombers, here comes another group. This time, 14 torpedo bombers from the USS Enterprise. And the Japanese are like, again, fine, let's do this. They shoot down most of these planes too. A few manage to drop their torpedoes, but guess what? Not a single one hits. Zero. Zilch. And then another group shows up. This time, it's 12 torpedo bombers from the USS Yorktown. And you guessed it, they get shredded. By now, the Japanese gunners are probably thinking, this is too easy. Are they even trying? At a sacrifice that changed everything, so you're thinking, what's the point? Spruance just threw dozens of planes into the meat grinder for nothing. But here's the genius part. While the Japanese are busy dealing with these low, flying torpedo bombers, all their fighters are down at sea level having a grand old time. And guess who's up at high altitude, totally unnoticed? the dive bombers. The moment it all changes, first to arrive are the dive bombers from the USS Enterprise. 37 planes swoop down from the sky like death on wings. They find the Japanese carriers completely exposed. Why? Because the decks are cluttered with planes, torpedoes, bombs. Basically, a giant fireworks display waiting to go off. Here's the thing about Japanese carriers, their decks were made of wood. Why? Because Japan was resource poor and steel was expensive. Meanwhile, American carriers had steel decks, which could take a hit. But these wooden decks, one good hit and kaboom, and that's exactly what happens. The dive bombers start their attack, and the Japanese carriers Akagi and Kaga are obliterated in minutes. Planes explode, bombs detonate, and the ships are consumed in flames. But wait, there's more. The Soryu is next. Dive bombers from the USS Yorktown finish the job, sending it to the bottom of the ocean. Now, 3 carriers are gone, leaving just one, the Hiryu. The Hiryu's commander, Yamaguchi Taemon, isn't ready to give up. He orders every plane he has to launch an all-out counterattack. No fighter escorts, no backup, just go. And you know what? His planes find the Yorktown. They attack it with everything they've got, and the Yorktown is eventually sunk. But the Hiryu's victory is short-lived. The Americans strike back, and the Hiryu meets the same fate as the other Japanese carriers. Yamaguchi, a brilliant strategist and one of the few Japanese leaders with real foresight, refuses to leave the sinking ship. He tells his men to deliver his officer's cap to his wife, then turns to the ship's captain and says, "Look at the moon. It's so beautiful. Let's go together." And just like that, they sink beneath the waves. Spruance's final masterstroke back on the American side. Spruance is faced with another big decision. His advisors say, "Let's chase down the rest of the Japanese fleet." But Spruance, in his usual calm way, says, "Nope, we're done. Everyone's tired. Let's go home." Why was this so smart? Because Yamamoto Aizoroku was lurking nearby with the massive battleship Yamato and 2 carriers. If the Americans had pushed their luck, Yamamoto might have turned the tide. But Spruance, he wasn't playing that game. He knew when to quit while he was ahead. 2 days later, he made another brilliant call. Instead of following the traditional pursue and destroy strategy, he ordered the fleet back to Hawaii. Think of it like cashing out your stocks at the peak of the market. Spruance knew he'd already won. No need to risk it all. And that, my friends, is how the Battle of Midway ended. The Americans lost 1 carrier, but the Japanese lost 4. It was the turning point in the Pacific War and the beginning of the end for Japan. Spruance didn't just win a battle. He changed the course of history. What did Japan do after the loss? So, Yamamoto Aizoroku comes back to Japan licking his wounds. But what does Japan tell its people? We won. Yep, they claimed victory. "Oh, we crushed an American naval base in the Aleutians," they said. Sure, the Aleutians, a barren wasteland where even rabbits wouldn't bother to poop. Meanwhile, they're covering up the fact that they just lost 4 aircraft carriers. What about the sailors who returned? Oh, they were silenced. Injured sailors were isolated, treated in secret, and often humiliated. Why? Because in Japan's militaristic culture, losing was shameful, even if you gave it your all. And the uninjured sailors? Well, they were sent off to some remote island in the South Pacific as cannon fodder. No letters home, no visits, just a one-way ticket to obscurity. In the end, the grunts paid the price for their country's bad decisions. What happened to Nagumo? Let's talk about Nagumo Chuichi, the guy at the center of it all. You'd think after losing 4 carriers, he might consider an honorable exit, right? Nope. He didn't have the guts to commit suicide at Midway. Instead, he got reassigned to defend Saipan. And when the Americans invaded Saipan, Nagumo finally did the deed. He committed suicide during that battle. Years later, Nagumo reportedly told others about the chaos at Midway, but by then the damage was done. The truth about the Battle of Midway remained a closely guarded secret in Japan for a long time. Why? Because that's what militarism does. It hides the failures and forces the weakest to carry the burden. Midway's long-term consequences, let's take a step back and look at the big picture. Midway wasn't just a tactical defeat for Japan, it was a strategic catastrophe. Japan lost over 300 experienced pilots in the battle. And these weren't rookies, they were some of the best in the world. Replacing them? Impossible. Training a fighter pilot wasn't cheap. In fact, there's an old saying, it costs us as much gold as a pilot's weight to train him. After Midway, Japan simply couldn't produce pilots fast enough, let alone experienced ones. By the end of the war, Japan was sending pilots into combat with only a few hours of training. This is how the infamous kamikaze squadrons came to be. And the ships? Oh, the ships. While the US was cranking out 1 aircraft carrier a month, Japan managed to build 1 carrier for the rest of the war. That's it. Why was America so much stronger? Let's break it down. America had a massive industrial base, endless resources, and a workforce that was already mechanically skilled. Think about it in Japan, most people didn't even drive cars. Meanwhile, in the US, everyone had a car and knew how to fix it. When war broke out, those skills translated directly into running machinery, fixing planes, and operating carriers. War is a furnace. It burns money, resources, and talent. And when your economy can't keep up, you're just throwing logs into a fire you can't control. There's a story from before the war where someone warned the Japanese. Don't pick a fight with America. Even if you win at first, we'll crush you before you ever reach US soil. But didn't the US win by luck? Now let's circle back to Midway. You're probably thinking, wasn't America just lucky? I mean, their torpedo bombers were terrible, they got wiped out, and the dive bombers only succeeded because the Japanese were distracted. Sure, luck played a role. But was it just luck? Let's dig deeper. The role of individualism, according to the book Carnage and Culture, the root cause of America's success wasn't just industrial strength. It was Western individualism. Sounds counterintuitive, right? After all, armies are supposed to be about discipline and following orders. But let me give you a few examples. 1. Code breaking. Remember how the Americans cracked Japan's naval code? That was thanks to 2 mid-ranking officers. One had a crazy Einstein like hairdo, and the other showed up to work in flip-flops. Can you imagine that in the Japanese military? No way. In Japan, you had to be perfectly dressed, perfectly disciplined, and follow every rule to the letter. But in America, if you could get the job done, no one cared how you looked. And cracking a code isn't just about training. It's about creativity, thinking outside the box, and connecting dots no one else sees. That's individualism at work. 2. Repairing the Yorktown. Let's talk about the miracle of the Yorktown. This ship was half sunk and limped back to Pearl Harbor. Normally, repairing a carrier would take months, assess the damage, make a plan, allocate resources. But Admiral Nimitz didn't have time for that. When the Yorktown arrived, Nimitz had already gathered 1,000 workers at the dock. As soon as the ship was secured, they swarmed it. Forget blueprints. Everyone just started fixing whatever they saw. Carpenters, welders, electricians, they all worked nonstop, using up so much power that the city of Pearl Harbor had to shut off electricity to civilian homes. 68 hours later, the Yorktown was back in action. You think that kind of improvisation happens in a rigid, rule-bound system? No chance. 3. Tactical decisions on the fly. Let's not forget the battle itself. American soldiers and officers made decisions on the spot, adapting to the chaos around them. Take the dive bomber pilots, for example. When they saw the Kaji and Kaga on fire, they didn't waste more bombs. They moved on to find other targets. That's how the Soryu and Hiryu were taken out. Even Admiral Spruance embodied this mindset, his orders to his pilots. Use aggressive attrition tactics to destroy as many enemy forces as possible. That's it. No micromanaging, no step-by-step instructions. Just trust your people to figure it out. Contrast that with Japan. Yamamoto and Nagumo stuck rigidly to their pre-made plans even when reality didn't match the blueprint. For example, Yamamoto could have sent the Yamato battleship straight to Midway. Its 18-inch guns could have flattened the island, eliminating the airfields entirely. But nope, Yamamoto stuck to his plan to stay back and wait for a decisive battle. Ironically, this rigidity also got Yamamoto killed. His plane was shot down because American codebreakers knew exactly where he'd be, down to the minute. Why? Because Yamamoto was so precise and predictable that it became a fatal flaw. Final thoughts. Midway wasn't just about luck or industrial strength. It was about a culture that valued flexibility, creativity, and individual initiative. And in a chaotic, high-stakes environment like war, those qualities can make all the difference. So, yeah, America got lucky at Midway, but they also made their own luck. Japan. They stuck to the rule book and paid the price. All right, folks, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. We're not just talking about the Battle of Midway anymore. We're talking about the fundamental difference between two ways of organizing people. And to kick things off, let me introduce you to a British general named William Slim. The wisdom of General Slim. Slim fought the Japanese in Burma during World War II. In 1942, he lost, but then later in the same theater, he turned the tables and defeated the Japanese. Reflecting on his experiences, Slim said something profound about the Japanese army. When their plans are working, they're as brave and ruthless as ants. But the moment their plans fall apart, they become as chaotic as ants are. It gets better. Slim went on to say that the Japanese weren't cowards in a physical sense. They were cowards in a mental sense. Why? Because they lacked the courage to adapt. They couldn't abandon their plans no matter what. Think about that for a second. What Slim was pointing out is the difference between collective courage, which comes from rigid planning, and individual courage, which is born out of flexibility and creativity. The power of individualism. Let's connect this back to Midway. American soldiers weren't fighting for some abstract idea like the United States of America. They were fighting for their way of life, their homes, and their freedom. That's a deeply personal motivation. And when you're motivated by your own values, the strength that comes out of that, it's unstoppable. That's not something you can replicate with propaganda or military indoctrination. Lessons for modern organizations. So, let's bring this into the modern era. Here's the genius of Carnage and Culture. It's a book about war, but every chapter makes you think, how can I apply this to running an organization? If you're running a company in today's AI driven world, the big question isn't just, how do I make my organization strong? It's, how do I make my organization strong in a way that unleashes individual potential? Let me give you an example from Google. At Google, and they have a saying, don't listen to the HPOs. What's a IPPO? It stands for the highest paid person's opinion. Imagine that, a company where the advice is not to listen to the boss. Why? Because Google hires creative geniuses who don't need constant management. These people thrive when given freedom, not rules. Here's a classic story from Google's early days. Larry Page, one of the co-founders, was upset about a product he didn't like. So he wrote a note about it and posted it in a public space at the office. A few engineers who weren't even on that product team saw the note, got inspired, and fixed the problem on their own time. That's the kind of environment where creativity thrives. Designing for creativity at Google, everything, from office layouts to the cafeteria, is designed to encourage creativity. For example, and their cafeteria lines are deliberately designed to make employees wait 4 minutes. Why 4 minutes? Because it's just long enough to encourage casual conversation, but not so long that people get bored and pull out their phones. Their offices, crowded. Desks are so close that if you swivel your chair, you'll bump into someone. Why? Because bumping into someone means you might spark a conversation, share an idea, and create something amazing. This is how modern companies are embracing the chaos of creativity by fostering individualism and spontaneous collaboration. The AI era and the new workplace now. Let's talk about where we're heading. In the era of AI, companies need to rethink their approach. And there are two major principles for modern management. One, always negotiate, forget about demanding sacrifice and loyalty from employees. That's old school. In today's workplace, leaders need to embrace negotiation. Employees are at their most creative when they're fighting for their own interests. So, be transparent. Discuss salaries, benefits, and goals openly. If employees feel valued, their creativity will shine. 2. Stop preaching values. Stop trying to shove corporate values down people's throats. Some startups go overboard, naming their conference rooms Tokyo and Paris, thinking they're building a culture. Nope. What really matters? Fair pay, a positive work environment, and meaningful projects. Employees will bring their own values if you just create the right conditions. The big question, what kind of strength do you want? Let's bring this full circle. When you think about Midway, you realize this wasn't just a clash of military forces, it was a clash of ideologies. Japan relied on collective discipline, strict plans, rigid hierarchies, and an inability to adapt. America relied on individualism, creativity, flexibility, and the courage to improvise. And look where that got them. Japan's, like, bravery crumbled the moment their plans fell apart. Meanwhile, the Americans improvised their way to victory, even if it wasn't pretty. As a leader in the AI era, you have to decide: do you want rigid, a top-down control? Or do you want the kind of dynamic, adaptive strength that comes from individual creativity? Take one last look at the Battle of Midway, and you'll find your answer.